Okay, we're starting the polishing process here, and as we went around the car originally, we saw a pretty wide variance between the thickness of the paint on different panels of the car. So the hood by far had the most consistently thick paint, where some of the other panels like the doors had much thinner paint, and some of the other odd panels here and there had thinner paint. So what we wanted to do before going forward with what we were originally expecting to do, which was doing a compounding step and then a finish polish step, was to first make sure we understood how much paint or oxidation was going to be coming off of the surface, because we don't want to risk the integrity of any of the thinner panels, inadvertently down the way and then accidentally cause damage or something like that. So we're being very cautious and conscientious of that. And what we're doing to kind of test before we move forward and engage the owner to make sure that he's aligned with the approach is we're doing a couple of different test spots here on a panel where we know we've got lots of material. So what we did was created a test area, and within it we created a grid using some dental floss and some tape to kind of give ourselves some very tight crosshairs and very precise crosshairs of where we're doing paint depth measurements, because what we're going to be doing is taking the measurements before the paint has been polished, and then we will go and do a one-step polish, and we'll likely do a two-step polish as well, but measure before and after and see how much material we're removing, so that we can predict when we get to a thinner panel like the door, if on average we're removing half a micron of material or 1 micron of material, we just know exactly what to expect on some of the other panels. So the reason why we're doing sort of this crosshair approach is even a centimeter apart or a half an inch apart, with the paint depth gauge, you can actually see a pretty wide variation. You could see a 10 micron difference in, just moving it, a half an inch. So that wasn't precise enough for us to kind of guess at where we were doing our befores and afters. So this way, when we've created these lines, we know with a much tighter accuracy where we did our paint depth measurements, so that we're not accidentally measuring half an inch in one direction, half an inch in another direction, and then getting wildly different results in our before and after test. So we're all set up here. What we've done is recorded on a piece of paper. We draw out our area. We do a grid of numbers, so it's almost like a topographic map. And then we have our before square. We're going to polish it, and then we're going to do our after, and then see if we can have a reasonable estimation of how much material was removed in doing a single stage. And then, if we're not completely satisfied with the results, this is a panel that could bear doing a compounding step as well. And that will also allow us to see ourselves, as well as the customer, exactly the difference between doing a compounding step first before a finished polish step. So that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to continue on with our test spots, and then we'll take some measurements afterwards. And the technique that I'm using as I'm doing the measurements here is I'm trying to visually first line up the paint depth gauge above the intersection of the two pieces of floss, but I can't measure through the floss. So what I'm trying to do is just get my fingers in the right position, then I move the pieces of floss out of the way, the string out of the way, and then just try and be straight up and down with my measurements. And I do several of them, because you can see even without trying to move, sometimes you get a different reading by 1 or 2 microns. So once the numbers start agreeing, and I'll snap it back and check my placement again. And if I can get things to agree, so somewhere around 136 or 135 seems to be the right number for that particular intersection. And then we move the string again and do our last point, and then we're going to do our comparison to get an average of how much material was removed over this entire section. So in general, what it's looking like is, I would say a third of the spots don't appear to have any material removed, but on average I would say about 1 micron of material, which is the oxidation, is removed through single stage polishing. So when you're talking about having 130 microns of material, and this is single stage paint, so basically from the metal to the top is 130 microns. If through single stage polishing we're removing oxidation and the top layer of scratched up surface is removing 1 micron, that's well under 1% of material removed. So that should have a negligible impact on the ability of the paint to kind of stay intact and so on. But where that becomes more important is if we're thinking now about panels that are 70 microns thick, if you're removing, again, 1 micron of material, that's now slightly more than 1%. But still in the grand scheme of things, 1% of material lost is not, it's not a huge amount of material. But that's where we need to start making a judgment call around if we're comfortable in losing a little bit of thickness on the thinnest panels in order to achieve, a shine and gloss and clarity that looks more like this. So with this section, we just finished doing a 2-step polish. So we did a compounding step, and then we did a finish polish on top. And what we learned from it was the compounding step does remove more material. So when we did the single step polishing, which we started with the oxidized surface, it was having some cutting effect, right? It was removing some of the oxidation. You can clearly see it's much clearer reflection with the single step polishing than it was before it started. And in that case, we were removing 2 to 3 microns of material. Now, most of that is probably the oxidation that's sitting on the surface, but it was removing 2 to 3 microns of material on average. When we did the cutting step, the interesting thing was that compounding step, the first one, which is designed to cut through the oxidation and the damage that's on the hood, that was removing 3 to 4 microns of material. So slightly more than the single step polish was able to do in that 2 minutes of passes that we were doing. But the other interesting thing was when we did the finish polish, we measured after cutting, and that was that 3 to 4 microns of material change. The finish polish in this case removed almost nothing. It was between 0 to 1 microns, and even that can be measurement error. So what that tells us is the material's being lost in that cutting step. It's not sort of a result of the finishing polish, and finishing polish in general does not remove a significant amount of material. This happens to have a significant amount of oxidation and contamination on that top surface, which has to be removed before you expose the clear paint. But that is done either through the compounding step or using your finishing polish as a compounding step. So in any event, you can see that doing the 2-step, it's definitely a clearer, and you've got better gloss and better clarity of reflection than you do on the single step, but you've removed probably about 1 extra micron of material, possibly 2, in going the full way, rather than trying to be as light as you can. So I hope that makes sense. It was interesting for us to kind of see the relationship between the compounding step and the finish polish step on a single stage paint like this Guards Red, and measuring at those different intervals along the way to show exactly where the paint material is being removed and by how much.